the first endgame I'm going to be showing is one of the most important rook endings for a chess player to know, and it's called the Lucena position. So the way you can recognize the Lucena position is one side, in this case white, has a passed pawn in the 7th rank. I should add white is going upwards, black is going downwards. So anyway, one side has a pawn on the 7th rank, and their king is directly in front of it. So in other words, their king is actually stopping the pawn's progress. Meanwhile, the other side has their rook directly behind the pawn. In this case, black's king is not actually threatening to take the pawn, so white's pawn is not going to hang anytime soon. And this position is actually going to be a win, but you have to know the proper sequence to achieve the win. So there are a lot of ways that white can try to win this, and I'll look at a few of them right now. So, of course, white is not going to win unless he can promote his pawn and win the rook in the process, thereby achieving an easy king and rook checkmate. So what if white just tries to promote the pawn immediately by moving the king out with, let's say, king to c7? Well, this may seem like a good idea, but the problem is black can just continue to check white. So black checks. If white ever wanders away too far from the pawn, black will just come back, forcing the white king to return. And if white tries to stay with the pawn, black is just going to keep checking forever, and white's king is not going to move anywhere. So it's clear that moving the king out immediately doesn't work. And because of this annoying king on the other side, it controls these two squares, meaning the king can't move there either. So if we take a closer look at the position, we'll note that black's king is only cut off by one file, the e file. So we need to make that two files. First, we have to cut off the king by another file, by pushing the king to the side of the board. Here, black can either move his king to the g file, to one of these squares, or he can move it to e6. If black goes to e6, then probably the easiest way of winning is just to go king to e8. And of course, black has to take the pawn now, otherwise white promotes. But now white can check, forcing the king to go here, continuing to protect the rook. Check. The king has to move, and the rook falls. So if we go back to this position, it's clear that black will have to go somewhere on the g file. And let's say he goes to g7. Now, once again, we can consider trying to move the king out to one of these squares. But once again, it's not going to work, as if you come out, black will check. And now white can actually even get as far as the 5th rank without hanging the pawn. But in this position, white has to move back, and he has not accomplished anything. So we could try to imagine, if only white had a piece he could put on d4 now, then the rook would simply not be able to come around and protect the d8 square. So how do we get a piece to d4? Well, if only our rook could somehow get there. And that is actually the purpose of white's second move, if we go back a bit. So if we go back here, white actually plays the somewhat unintuitive rook to f4. And the idea is he's going to try this exact same sequence I discussed earlier, where the king comes out, and then the rook will block a check. So let's see that plan in action. So, of course, black cannot really move the rook away, because then white can simply bring the king out anyway. And now if black moves the king, he gets nothing done, and basically it won't really matter what black does. So let's just say he moves the rook on the file. It doesn't really matter where. Now white can bring the king out to e7 or to c7. Black will obviously have to check the king, like this. Now white should bring the king here, and black is obviously forced to check again. Now white keeps maneuvering until he can get the king to d5, like this. And now rook to d1 is forced, and we see the plan we've been discussing this whole time, where the rook moves to d4. Now black is forced to take, and the pawn will promote next move, therefore securing an easy win. So, the main takeaways from the Lucena position are, first, the black king should be cut off by 2 or more files, which is why we played the move rook f1. And second, after this, white should move the rook to the 4th rank, so that he can therefore do what's called building a bridge, where as he brings the king out, the rook is there to shield a check. The second position is considered also one of the most important rook endings to know, and this one is actually called the Philidor position. So to recognize the Philidor position, one side, in this case we have it black, and black has an extra pawn. Usually it's pretty far advanced, in this case on the 4th rank. And this time, instead of black's king being in front of the pawn, it's white's king. So in other words, white's king is in the way of the pawn. So white's king is going to have to move out of the way for the pawn to promote. So this position is actually a draw, and that's only for the only reason that white's king is the one that is blocking the pawn. So if it was black's turn, black could try and bring the king in, trying to create some annoying mate threats. And if white were to just do nothing, black can play a move like this. And here it's still a draw, actually, but it's definitely going to be a lot more difficult now. So what white needs to do in order to draw this position is he has to take control of the 3rd rank. So note that black's king has no way of entering the position. Of course, most of the time, if black chooses to trade the rooks, let's say by doing a maneuver like this, it's just going to be a draw after the trade. So that doesn't do anything. If black simply tries to check white, well, white can just move back and forth, and no progress is made from black. So now, sooner or later, black is going to have to play the move d3. And this may look like a pretty menacing move, but it actually isn't going to do that much. The key strategy here now is to play the move rook h8. And the idea is, white is now going to check the king from behind, and black is actually not going to be able to do too much about it. If we go back to the original position, here, if white tried to do this checking from behind method here, well, if black simply took some space and white tried checking here, it would still be a win actually now for black. Sorry, not a draw. And once black brings the king in here, now we can see some annoying mate threats. However, the difference between these positions is if we look at the position we were discussing earlier. Here, once white moves up, if black tries to invade with the king, note that the d3 square is no longer available for the king. So once white checks, of course if the king strays far away, white can just continue checking. And now eventually black is going to have to agree to a draw, because black can make no progress. That is how you can draw the Philidor position. The third position I'm going to show you is actually pretty much the same as the second one. And this is actually the exact same, this position has the exact same characteristics as the Philidor, except we'll notice that this time the pawn is a knight pawn. That is a b pawn or a g pawn. Here we can use the same drawing mechanism I discussed earlier. However, there's actually an easier way to draw this time. If we go back to the original position, the previous Philidor position that is, if we scroll back to the very beginning, from here, I mentioned the move rook h3. But what if white tries to play passively and plays a move like this, allowing something like this to happen, where white just lets black invade? So if we get to some sort of position like this, of course, neither side is playing very good moves here. Well, if white tries to just defend passively, like this, let's say, black is going to win eventually. And that is because, in this position, black has a nice idea where he can bring the rook around to the other side and give checkmate. For example, if white continues to do nothing, well, in this case, black should go king to e3. And here, if white continues to wait, simply a move like rook to h2 will just win, because now the rook will get to h1, and the pawn will have a clear path to the bottom. So because of this, it's clear that passive defense in this position does not work, and that's why you have to use the same method I discussed earlier, where you play rook to h3, stopping the king from entering, followed by rook h8 to check from behind. However, in the position with the knight pawn, white can throw all that out of the window. White can just defend passively, actually, and he can allow black to get the optimum positions for all of his pieces. As long as white just keeps the rook on the first rank, no matter what black does, it's actually still going to be a draw. And we can think of it like this. If we remember the previous position, black would win this by bringing the rook around, and oh wait, there's no file that he can go that isn't occupied by the king. So black actually is out of files to go to in this position. There's actually no file to the left of the A file, so black can never actually checkmate. Even if black were to reroute his king, like this, the A1 square is never going to be defended. So it's actually going to still be a draw. And just to illustrate this, if white just keeps maneuvering, even if black tries to move b2 here, threatening to checkmate, white can simply go rook to g3 and take the pawn with a draw. So in this position, there's actually nothing that black can do, as I've been saying. So you can just remember, if there's a knight pawn in a Philidor position, that is a b pawn or a g pawn, then white doesn't need to use the same active defense that I discussed earlier. White can just play the move rook to e1 or rook to the first rank and simply move the rook back and forth, making sure never to allow checkmates on the a file. So that's how you can draw a Philidor position when there's a knight pawn. The fourth position I'm going to be showing is one that's not so likely to appear in an actual game, as usually there are some better alternatives earlier, but it does a good job of illustrating a couple of important rook ending principles. So from here, it's black to play in this position, and black is obviously going to be trying to draw since white is up a pawn. What black wants to do here is black just doesn't want to allow the rook to move out of the way, because of course if the rook ever moves out of the way, the pawn will queen and the game will be over. So of course black is going to have to keep his rook on the a file at all times, because if he ever moves away, simply a move like, let's say, rook to c8 is going to be sufficient. Because now, regardless of what black does, let's say black tries to go back, white will queen and win the rook after takes. So from the starting position, black is going to have to keep his rook on the a file at all times. So black has a couple of ways to try and draw, and let's look at each of them. One way is to just move the king back and forth. So let's say that white tries to achieve his goal. Of course, white needs to get the king somehow over here. So black just passes back and forth. And it may seem as though white's position is starting to get a bit scary. After all, white's only a few more moves away from getting to b6. But black actually still has nothing to worry about. Of course, the rook will have to move. And now white's king tries to come in. But here we start to come across a kind of a major problem. Once white gets here, let's say, black can just start checking white. And white actually has no way of making it closer to the pawn without acknowledging these checks. So black can just keep on checking. If white comes pretty far back, of course, black keeps the pressure on this pawn. And there's actually no way for white to make any more progress. So if this type of position comes across in an actual game, well, you should know that if you have black in this type of position, the easiest strategy to draw is to just play king here and king back, and making sure to always check white if you have your rook active. However, what if black thinks, oh, well, can I just bring the king over and win the pawn? Well, this may seem like a very good idea, but if you try it, it actually illustrates a nice endgame principle that's very important to know. So white will have to try the exact same technique, bringing the king over, followed by bringing it up. Now, let's say black checks, it doesn't really matter, white can go here. And now black thinks, okay, well now I'm going to get the king over, right? Actually, white is completely winning now, and that's due to a nice tactic involving a skewer. White can play the move rook to h8, threatening to queen the pawn. However, of course, wouldn't black just take? Well, now white goes here, and he's going to win the rook next move, like this. So the key to avoiding this tactic, if you have black, is you have to make sure, if you get a position like this, never let your king stray further than the f file, or the third file from the edge of the board. If black does this, he's actually just going to lose. So it's important to keep the king in the corner, which seems like it may not be such a good idea, since usually we're told to keep our king active in endgames. However, this case is actually a major exception to that rule. The fifth ending I'm going to be showing involves a queen versus a passed pawn on the 7th rank. So as you can see, white is up a queen. Meanwhile, black has this passed pawn on the 7th, and at the moment, it's actually blocked by his king. So clearly, white is the one playing for the win, because if white can ever stop this pawn from promoting permanently, then white will just bring the king in, win the pawn, and then checkmate. So it's up to white to find a way of doing so. So, of course, white is never going to win this game without his king. So what white needs to do is white needs to try and bring the king one step closer every chance he gets. At the moment, since black's king is blocking its pawn, black can't push his pawn, which of course would always be a draw. So in this position, white can bring the king one step closer with king to b7. Now, of course, black will have to move the king out of the way, since it's the only legal move. And let's say he moves to f2. Now, what white has to do is white has to somehow force the king to go back in front of its pawn. Because, of course, if the pawn can promote, then the king is never going to be able to get closer. So what white needs to do is white needs to start bringing the queen gradually closer and closer to the black king. He can only do this by giving lots of checks. So I would recommend starting with the check, queen to f5. So after queen f5, black has a few squares to go to. Note that if the king ever moves to e1, white can simply bring the king further, since of course there's no threat to queen. So from here, black should probably go to one of these few squares. Let's say he goes here. Now, like I said earlier, white wants to keep bringing the queen gradually closer and closer. White can play this check, forcing the king to move to the side, and now white can check again, forcing the king to go back. But now, how does white win? How can white get the queen any closer without allowing the pawn to promote? Of course, if white goes back and forth, he makes no progress. So white has to use a nice endgame idea. White has to play the move queen to e3. Even though this isn't check, clearly queening would hang the pawn, so now black is forced to move the king to the first rank. Now, white has one nice way of winning, and that has to play queen f3, forcing the king to go in front of the pawn. Note that in this position, the king as well as the pawn are both being simultaneously attacked. Once the king goes in front, white can simply bring the king one step closer. And now we repeat the exact same process. Black brings the king out, threatening to queen. White begins checking, gradually edging closer and closer. And now we have the key. The way of remembering this is if the king is ever one file apart, that is, there's one file in between the king and its pawn, white should always try and move the queen to one square behind the pawn, so in this case e3. If white can do this, that'll therefore force the king to go back. And if the king is ever on the first rank, most of the time it's pretty easy to win just by giving enough checks until the king is forced to move in front of its pawn. And now the king will edge closer and closer. So if we continue with the same path as usual, by gradually checking the king, if the king goes here, we have the exact same idea. Remember, the king is still one file apart from its pawn, and therefore we can move the queen one square behind the pawn. This time it's check. And from here, we check again. And from here, it's not too difficult to win anymore. The king moves out of the way. And now white can actually just play queen to d3, because the king, of course, protects the queen. Now, once again, the king has to go in front of the pawn. And now, simply king to e3 should win. After king to f1, only legal move, the pawn falls, and soon mate will be delivered. This strategy will work for any pawn when you have a queen versus pawn position, unless it's a rook pawn, that is an a or h pawn, or a bishop pawn, a c or f pawn, and I'll be discussing both of those cases later. To win this type of position, there are three things you need to remember. The first thing is whenever the king is in front of its pawn, you can bring the king closer. The second thing is whenever the king is 2 files away from the pawn, that is, there's a file separating them, you should try and bring the queen one square in front of the pawn. And third, whenever the king is one square diagonally from the pawn, you have to find a check that forces the king in front. That is, for example, if we go through the line I discussed earlier, let's say we have a position like this. These are all moves I've discussed previously. You have to find one move that forces the king in front of the pawn. And in this case, that would just be queen to f3, pushing the king in front. And from here, you can just repeat the process. Bring the king closer, force the king 2 files away, and then so on and so forth. The sixth endgame I'm going to show is similar to the last one. That is, there's a pawn on the 7th, once again. The opposing side has a queen, and the pawn is 1 square away from promotion. However, the previous position I showed had a central pawn, a king or a queen pawn. However, this position involves a bishop pawn, which in this case is the f pawn. I should add, white is still moving upwards, black is still moving downwards. So in this position, it's black to move, of course. If it was white to move, white would just queen. So black can use the same method I taught last time by playing this move and forcing this. And from here, black may feel pretty confident. It looks like black is just going to bring the king in, right? Well, that's true, but that's only for now. Once white brings the king out of the way, now black can give some checks, forcing the king over. And remember, in this position, there's 1 file separating the king and the pawn. Now black can use the technique I described earlier, putting the queen 1 square behind the pawn. Now this is forced, of course. Sorry. And now it may look as though white has to move in front of the pawn, right? Well, actually no. I'll give you a few seconds to try and find the drawing idea. That's right, the king actually doesn't need to go in front of its pawn. Here, white can move the king to the corner, because if takes, well, we have stalemate. And actually, this motif will work no matter whether it's an f pawn or a c pawn. Whenever the queen tries to check, the king can simply move to the corner. So, from here, after king to the corner, if black just keeps checking, well, no progress is made. So, from here, the main takeaways from this type of position are, first, you have to remember the stalemating trick. And second, the key is to actually keep the king towards the corner. That is, if the king keeps wandering away on this side, well, it's not going to be a draw because there is no stalemating technique on this side. If white just goes back to the other side, well, there's suddenly not going to be a stalemating trick because in a position like this, of course, this is just going to immediately lose. So we have to remember, keep the king towards the corner when you're trying to draw this position. And of course, whenever the queen tries to get too close, make sure that you have the stalemate trick ready. The next position I'm going to be showing is where there's a king and queen, except this time, the passed pawn that's on the 7th rank happens to be a rook pawn. So, from here, we can see that, once again, of course, white is going upwards, black is coming downwards. And you may know that rook pawns often tend to be exceptions in a lot of endgames, like, for example, in rook endings are one. And the same holds true when you have a queen versus a pawn ending. So, in this position, black can do a lot of things, but to follow with the principles, he might want to play king to b2, simply bringing the king closer, as the king is in the corner. White can simply bring the king out, and now black will try the exact same drawing technique, forcing the king back into the corner by using the same techniques. So he follows all the techniques until here. But now, normally white would be forced to move into the corner, and he still is. But now you notice, if black brings the king further, we reach a stalemate. And that's because there is no file to the right of the H file that the white king can go to. Because of that, this position is actually a dead draw. There are no other ways for black to force white into the corner without using the G file. Note that whenever the queen steps onto the G file, regardless of whether king h8 is forced, white can actually just go there anyway, because, well, black's queen will have to move again, and we reach the same draw. There's no way for black to force the king into the corner without using this technique. In this exact case, of course, white can never wander too far away, because black's queen will get in front of the pawn. And therefore, if white just sticks to the plan by playing like this, there's never going to be any progress made, and the game will end in a draw. The 8th endgame I'm going to be showing is very similar to the last one that I showed, in that there's a queen for one side and a rook pawn for the other. However, this time the rook pawn is not yet on the 7th rank, and we already discussed if the pawn is on the 7th, it's an easy draw. However, if the pawn is on the 6th, there is actually a win for white. So there are a few ways of achieving this win, but the easiest way is to follow kind of the same principles I discussed earlier, where you gradually try and bring the queen closer with checks, and eventually there's a special motif I'm going to be showing. So the easiest way to win is, of course, to bring the queen in, to gradually bring the queen closer, like this, for example. And we bring the queen pretty close to the king, and now the strategy is we want to check on the G file, so the file next to the pawn. So we can play a move queen to G5 check. Now there are a few options for black. If the king ever moves in front of the pawn, there are several ways of winning, but you can just play king to B7 and you'll eventually win. So probably the king should go here. Now we can use the same techniques I discussed in all of the previous endgames involving queens, where note that the king is 2 files away from its pawn, so white can check right behind the pawn, forcing the king over, and here. And now, of course, the king has to go in front, but now we notice, well, the king can just come in. But actually, it's even easier than this. After king h1, the h-pawn is hanging, and since king h1 is the only legal move, takes is just immediately going to win the game. So that is one of the techniques that you can use to win, and another technique involves a nice trap that you can set. So if we go back to the beginning, of course we know that if the h-pawn ever pushes, it's a draw, but there's one thing that is different about this position. If white plays a move like queen to f4, let's say, the h-pawn can't push, and that's because we have queen f1 checkmate. So, based on that, we can conclude if the king is in the corner and the h-pawn is on h2, if the queen can check on f1, it'll actually going to be mate. So we can just keep threatening the f1 square. Once the king moves out of the way, of course here, queen to g3 is going to win the pawn. So king to g2. Now we can just use the same techniques as before, where we check, forcing the king in front, bring the king up, and oops, the pawn is hanging. So we just win. Those are some of the methods that I would recommend using to win a position where we have a queen versus an h-pawn, but the h-pawn is instead of the 7th on the 6th rank. The 9th endgame I'm discussing today is a more complicated one, and this one may deserve more careful study than some of the others. So we notice that black is up 2 pawns, and they're both pretty far advanced. So is it time to get scared with white? Actually, not at all. This is a dead drawn position, but it does require some skill to hold it. Basically, what we can start by doing is imagining, what if the bishop and both of these pawns were taken off the board? Well, we notice that black will only have a king and a bishop, meanwhile white will just have a king. So that's obviously a book draw, because there's no way to make progress. So, based on that, we can reverse engineer that white would always be happy to sacrifice his bishop for black's 2 pawns. That makes sense, right? So, basically, what white wants to do is if black ever pushes his pawns, white can simply sacrifice his bishop for both of them. So, because of that, we know that if black is ever able to push one pawn, white either has to find something special or be able to sacrifice his bishop for both of them. So the way I would start by drawing this is I would play the move bishop to b3 check. And giving a check is usually not a bad idea, unless black has something specific he can do. So let's say black goes to e5. Now, surprisingly, the only drawing move is to play bishop c2. The idea is, if black ever pushes this d-pawn, then white can take it. So for example, if pushes, takes is a draw. And if black just does nothing by, let's say, moving the king, well, white can simply just wait. If black never pushes this d-pawn, or this e-pawn, let's say, it's just going to be a draw, because he cannot make any progress. Note that the bishop is actually especially useful on c2/b1, because it also threatens the e4 pawn, so the king can never run away, because you can just take the pawn. So, sooner or later, if we get to a position like this, black is going to have to push his e-pawn. And pushing the e-pawn is actually a pretty simple draw now. White can simply just put his king in front of the pawn, and now, whatever black does, white can put the bishop in front of the other pawn. And because of this bishop's inability to control light squares, this is actually a dead draw. Whenever black's king moves, all white has to do is keep control of the d3 square at all times. So, no matter where black positions the rest of his pieces, it's going to be a draw, because the d4 pawn can never move to d3. So, after digesting all of this, if we go back to the original position, you may wonder, well, let's say after king to e5, well, we've already discussed stopping the d3 pawn push, so why can't you play, let's say, bishop to c4? Doesn't this also stop d3? Because, of course, takes is a draw. Well, yes and no. It does stop the move d3, but actually black is winning this time. And the reason is because the bishop on c2 was especially useful in a position like this, because not only does it stop the d3 push, it also threatens e4. And the point of threatening e4 is, of course, black's king can never wander away. However, if we go back to the position where we put the bishop on c4, the e4 pawn is not even threatened. So, though of course it still takes some care to win as black, black can actually just move the king wherever he would like, let's say to f4. Now, if white tries to keep the bishop on this diagonal, there are some ways of trying to win this, and they are not the easiest though, but the point is black can just move the king. And from here, since the e4 pawn is of course not under attack, there's nothing that white can do to stop black's king from roaming. So that's why the c2 bishop is such an important square. So from here, as I discussed earlier, of course e3 can never be played. But black might try to do something like this. If he tries checking, what if he tries to bring the king around this way? And the answer is that actually nothing will really happen. As long as white always keeps the bishop on this diagonal, threatening e4 and stopping the push to d3, it's just going to be a draw, no matter what black tries. So the keys to this endgame are, first of all, if we go back to the initial position, always make sure that your bishop is on c2 or whatever square attacks a pawn and stops the other pawn from pushing. This is especially important because the king cannot be allowed to wander. Second of all, you need to make sure, if black ever pushes the other pawn, in this case e3, that you can set up what's called a blockade. And as I described earlier, if pushes, you can go here and always keep the d3 square under control. You have to make sure that this can always be set up if one of the pawns is pushed. The next endgame I'm going to be showing illustrates an incredibly important concept that every player needs to know. This concept is called the concept of the outside passed pawn. So, at first glance, this might seem like a pretty scary position for white to deal with. After all, black has an active king, an advanced passed pawn, and it doesn't really look like white's pawns are doing too much anywhere. However, this is actually a winning position for white. The reason lies in what's called an outside passed pawn. So, what white needs to do is white wants to create a passed pawn on this side of the board. So, if we can just imagine for a second, let's say that both of the g pawns were removed from the position. If that position were to happen, let's just say we can play a move like this, And this is basically the exact same as the g-pawns being removed, because we have the two g-pawns here, and if we go forward with that sequence, the g-pawns have now gone missing. So, if we imagine this position, it might seem like black is still doing well, because, as you can see, his pawn is still pretty far advanced, his king is still active, and white's king is still not doing much. However, this is actually a pretty easy win for white, and that's because if black tries to push his pawn, white can simply push his. Eventually, black will be forced to run after it. Now, white can take the pawn, and if black takes this pawn, well, you'll see white is just too fast to reach this side of the board. Black can try as much as he would like to come back over, but ultimately white is just going to be up 2 pawns for nothing, and this is a pretty easy win. So if we go back to the original position, we can see that if white is able to create some passed pawn on the h-file, he can use it to deflect black's king as a decoy, essentially, to win black's pawn and then proceed to win the queen side. So because of that, white should start with the move h3, as this move will hope to create a passed pawn. So there are some options for black here. Of course, we already discussed this g takes h3 position, as white can simply push his pawn on the king side, ultimately grab black's pawn, and bring it over. So let's say black doesn't play g takes h3, and instead, he just waits on the queen side. Well, here, the easiest way to win is just to take the g4 pawn. After king takes, we reach the same position where white had an outside passed h-pawn, except this time he has a g-pawn. Now, white can come up with his king, hoping to eat this pawn. Now, if black keeps defending, there's a nice move that white can play. It's not strictly necessary, of course, but white can play the move g4. Now, of course, if the king waits, white will push the pawn, and sooner or later, black is going to have to take it, allowing recaptures. So, from here, this is basically the same position we would have reached by any other sequence. Black will try in vain to reach the queen side, but white is simply too fast. And eventually, the queenside pawns will just be lost. So, what are some of the key takeaways from this endgame? Well, if we go back to the beginning, first of all, an outside passed pawn is a very valuable asset in an ending. An outside passed pawn can be defined by a pawn that is far away from the remaining pawns. So, therefore, if we consider that these pawns on the queen side are the remaining pawns, we notice if white is able to create a passed h-pawn, it'll be further away from the remaining pawns than black's passed e-pawn. So eventually, white can use the pawn as a decoy to lure black's king away, and eventually, white is going to come over and take all of black's pawns. That is how you can win an endgame like this. The 11th endgame I'm going to be showing illustrates a relatively simple but often hard to understand concept, and this concept is known as triangulation. Though it sounds like a complicated word, triangulation simply means wasting a move to turn a position into a better position. So there are already a lot of things to be considered in the original position. Of course, white wants to promote his passed pawn, while black wants to stop him. So what are white's options, and what does black do about each? Let's say that white brings the king up. Well, black, of course, will take the opposition by doing this, and if white ever retreats, black can just copy. So if white pushes, we actually just reach a draw, because this is a well-known drawn position. So if white tries to go king to e6, king to e8 will simply stop white from making any further progress in this line. What if white tries to move king to f5? If black does nothing, white can just come in and win black's h-pawn, which should be an easy win. However, the problem for white is black can just play the move king to f7. Now, white is forced to move back, and black can come back as well. Now we've just reached the initial starting position, so it's clear white hasn't done something right. So, white has a few other options. White can either move the king to the side, which would allow a simple move like king to f7, forcing a repetition, or he can move the king back to a square like e4 or f4. So, let's say white moves to e4. Take a second and see what would you play if you had the black pieces. Of course, white is still winning this position, but it's interesting to try and figure out what the best defense is for black. So let's take a look at some of the consequences of this position. If black plays the move king to f7, white can simply bring the king up. And now, if black moves back, then white will come in and win h6 with an easy win. However, what if black moves to the side, like this? Well, if white tries to come back, we reach the starting position once again. And if white plays this move, and in this position, if white plays here, black will just come back. Now this will reach us back to the starting position. So it's pretty clear that king e8 is probably the best way for black to play. But what does white do now? Well, simply moving the king forwards is not going to do anything, because, as we already discussed, black has good responses to each. What white needs to do is he has to wait another move. White has to play the move king to f4. So you'll notice that, of course, king to f7 loses again due to king f5 and the king infiltrating. So f7 is actually a poison square for black, unless white's king is already on f5. You also will remember that in the original position, what white wanted to do was white wanted to reach this position, except he wanted it to be black's move. So black would have to move back, and white would push with the opposition. So if we go back to the position that we've been discussing, right here, then it's clear, of course, king f7 doesn't work, and king f8 is therefore the only option. So from here, white can actually play the move king to e5. And now the idea is, if black moves to the side, like he has been trying a lot, white can go king e6. And now we actually reached a position we already discussed a lot earlier, which specifically would be this one. Except in this position, it's white to move, meaning black has the opposition. But in the position that we're on right now, after the following sequence, it's black's move, allowing this move, followed by push, here, and here, soon to be a promotion. So, therefore, it's pretty clear that after king to e5, king e8 will lose, because white will get the opposition. And we already know that the move king to f7 will lose in pretty much any position, because this is a poison square unless white's king is on f5. But here, since it's black's turn, black can move back, and white will come in and win the pawn, soon to be the game. However, there's one last trick left for black in this line. So, from this position, after king to e5, in this line with king to e8, after pushes, here, 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 king up, black can play this move. And now, black may hope that white will immediately play f8 queen, but this is actually just a draw due to stalemate. So white has to be very careful. The easiest way to win is just to wait one move with the king. And now once the king moves, queening will be with check. So this is a pretty easily won position. Therefore, the main takeaways from this endgame are white needs to wait until he can get a position where it's the favorable side's turn to move. That is, he has to wait a few moves and then bring his king back to e5. Because now black is forced to make a move he doesn't want to. That is, he's in zugzwang. He has to play king f7 or king e8. And after either of those moves, white has a specific corresponding move that will win the game. The final endgame I'm going to be showing today shows several nice principles that I think are very important to learn. So in this position, once again, white is moving upwards, black is coming downwards, and we see that actually in this position it starts off as black to move. So there are a lot of options for what black can do. Black, of course, wants to win white's pawn, while white, if possible, will take black's pawn. So from here, what if black tries to immediately grab white's pawn with the move king to d4? if black tries this, then white can actually play the move king f5. And now we are in a place of reciprocal zugzwang, as it is sometimes called. Whoever's side to move actually loses. Since it's black's turn, black will have to move away, and after white takes, it's an easy win for white. Similarly, if it were white's turn, white would have to move away, and then black would take, winning the pawn and the game. Therefore, king to d4 is not an acceptable move for black to play. King to d6 is an option for black, which we may discuss later, but let's say black tries king to c4, intending to come around the pawn from behind. Now, the idea is, let's say white just plays a move like king to f5, then all of a sudden we reach a position that we got earlier, where this time it's actually white to move, so black will win the game. Therefore, white should not play king to f5. What if white tries king to g5, simply copying black? Well, then, what if black plays king to d4? Well, we've fallen into the same trap as before, where this time it's black to move, and the pawn is lost. However, black doesn't need to do this. Black can actually play the move king to d3. Of course, white has to protect the pawn, otherwise he loses, but we'll find that he will lose anyway, because now, once the king moves away, black wins the pawn, and with it the game. So what has white done wrong? It seems like king to d3 is just an inevitable consequence, right? Well, not exactly. White has one try left to him. Since we've already discussed these two moves, white will have to bring the king back and hope to survive. If white just tries to play this move, well, black can simply come and attack the pawn. White will protect it. Black will push. He will push the king up. And now it seems as though white is just going to lose, right? He'll lose the pawn and with it the game. However, king e2 is actually a blunder here, since after this position, we reach a well-known win because black will be able to push his pawn. Therefore, in this position, white actually has to play the move king f2, and this is actually going to be a draw because if black takes, white has the opposition, and it's well known that this type of position is a pretty easy draw for the defender. Therefore, what can we take away from this position? In the end, it was simply a draw, but there were a lot of interesting ideas that were presented along the way. Remember, if the king ever moves to this square, in this case d4, whoever's side to move it is in this position will lose. A common idea in these types of positions is to try and come around behind, like this. And that was illustrated in this variation, where black attacks the pawn from behind, forcing the king to move to the deadly square, where this will win. And at the very end, we found that the easiest way to draw, and as a matter of fact the only way to draw for white, is to simply play passively, which is typically not a good idea in other endings, but in this exact case it is. Eventually, white can go back to the textbook draw of king and pawn versus king, where the defender has the opposition. And we reached a well-known stalemate type of position at the very end.